The Apartment of Silence, the true story of the Hello Kitty murder case. There is a particular kind of darkness that hides in plain sight. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't creak under the floorboards or flicker behind broken windows. It settles quietly into the fabric of ordinary places, a narrow hallway, a dim apartment, a street that thousands of people walk down every day without ever once feeling afraid. Hong Kong, 1999. The city breathes at all hours. Neon signs bleed their colors down wet pavement. Market stalls fold into the night and open again before the sun rises. The harbor catches light from every direction, and the skyline, one of the most recognizable on Earth, stands like a postcard that never stops printing itself. But behind the postcard, behind the glass towers and the ferry crossings and the dim sum carts rattling through morning corridors, there are streets that the postcard never shows. Narrow lanes in Tsim Sha Tsui. Residential blocks where the walls are thin and the hours are long, and nobody asks questions because nobody wants to know the answers. This is where the story begins. Not with violence, not yet. It begins with a teenage girl, 14 years old, who starts waking up in the middle of the night with the same dream. She doesn't call it a nightmare, she calls it a visitation. A woman is coming to her in the dark, standing at the edge of sleep, her mouth moving but making no sound. The girl doesn't know who the woman is, not at first, but the face is specific, detailed, real. And that detail will eventually lead the police to something they were never supposed to find. The year is 1999, and the city of Hong Kong is still in the quiet aftershock of transition. 2 years have passed since the handover from British to Chinese rule, and the social fabric of the territory is still adjusting, legally, culturally, psychologically. Law enforcement is modernizing, trust in institutions is fragile, and in the dense residential blocks of Tsim Sha Tsui, people are learning once again how to look away. The girl's name has never been publicly released. In court documents, she is referred to only as a witness. She is 14, and she is terrified, and what she carries with her into the police station on a March morning in 1999 is not just a confession, it is the only reason this case was ever solved at all. She tells the officers that she cannot sleep, that she has not slept properly in weeks, that the woman in her dreams is telling her something, not in words, but in the sheer insistence of her presence. She appears every night, always the same face, always the same silence. The officers listen, and then they ask her what she knows. What she knows is this. Several months earlier, she had been living, along with several other young women, in a flat in Tsim Sha Tsui. The flat was controlled by a man named Chan Man Lok. He was in his early 20s. He had a reputation in certain circles, the kind of reputation that is communicated through silence rather than speech, through the speed with which people change the subject when his name comes up. Inside that flat, something had happened to a woman named Fan Man Yi. And in the weeks and months since, the girl had been trying to survive her knowledge of it. To understand what happened to Fan Man Yi, you have to understand how she arrived in that flat, because her story doesn't begin in Tsim Sha Tsui. It begins years earlier, in a life that had already given her very little to hold on to. Fan Man Yi was born in 1967. She grew up in circumstances that offered her few protections and fewer choices. By her late 20s, she was working in hostess bars in Hong Kong, a world that exists in a complicated space between entertainment and exploitation, between visibility and invisibility. She was known to those around her as Ah Fong. She was bright, and she was tough, and she had survived things that would have broken others. But the world she moved through was not a forgiving one, and in it she made the kind of mistake that, in retrospect, sounds almost unbearably ordinary. She stole something. Approximately 10,000 Hong Kong dollars, taken, it is believed, from a client. The theft was discovered, and the man who discovered it, directly or indirectly, was Chan Man Lok. Now, 10,000 Hong Kong dollars in 1999 is not a small amount, but it is not a catastrophic one. In most circumstances, it would be a matter of debt, of repayment, of some negotiated consequence. But Chan Man Lok was not a man who operated within ordinary social contracts. He moved in the margins of triad-adjacent criminality, the kind of environment where debts are not repaid in money, but in suffering, or punishment is not a proportional response, but a demonstration. Fan Man Yi was brought to the flat in Tsim Sha Tsui, and she did not leave it alive. What occurred inside that flat over the weeks that followed is documented in court records that are, to this day, among the most disturbing in Hong Kong's legal history. The details are not ones that serve the story to reproduce, but the shape of what happened matters, because it speaks to something far darker than the crime itself. It speaks to the machinery of complicity, the way ordinary people can be drawn into orbit around a single point of cruelty and find themselves unable to escape it. Chan Man Lok was not alone. Two women, both in their early 20s, participated in what was done to Fan Man Yi. Their names, eventually released, Leung Xing Qi and Leung Wei Lun. They were not strangers to Chan Man Lok. They were in various complicated ways under his influence, through fear, through dependency, through the particular gravity that certain personalities exert over those who have nowhere else to go. The girl who came to the police, the 14-year-old, was also in that orbit. But she was younger, and something in her had not yet been fully extinguished. Fan Man Yi died in late 1998. The exact date is uncertain, but it was somewhere in the final months of the year. She had been held, harmed, and ultimately killed over a period of approximately 1 month. She was 31 years old. What happened next is the part of the story that gives the case its name. The name that has followed this case for 25 years. The name that turns a tragedy into something almost mythological in its horror. After Fan Man Yi died, her body was not disposed of in any conventional way. Instead, the three perpetrators, Chan Man Lok and the two women, dismembered her remains. They boiled the flesh from her bones, and then, in an act that defies rational explanation, they placed her skull inside a large stuffed toy, a Hello Kitty mermaid doll. The doll sat in the flat, pink and silent and familiar, the kind of object you walk past 100 times in a shopping center without giving it a second thought, the kind of object that, in a different context, belongs in a child's bedroom. Here, it was a vessel, a hiding place, and, as it turned out, an object so deeply associated with innocence that its contamination became the detail that lodged in the public imagination and refused to leave. The skull was sewn inside the doll's body, and there it remained, for months. The girl had been in the flat during this period. She had seen things. She had been told things implicitly and explicitly. She had been kept close enough to be implicated, close enough to be silenced. Chan Man Lok and the two women believed that her proximity made her complicit, and her complicity made her controllable. They were almost right. But then, the dreams started. She described them to investigators in terms that were almost clinical in their specificity. Fan Man Yi's face, her silence, the quality of her stillness, not peaceful, but waiting. The girl would wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and know with the certainty that only sleeplessness can produce that something was required of her. It took her weeks to act, possibly months. The exact timeline is difficult to establish because the girl herself was struggling to hold it together, to maintain the performance of normalcy that survival in Chan Man Lok's orbit required. She had to seem untroubled, she had to seem loyal, and all the while the dreams continued. In March 1999, she walked into a police station. She told the officers that she had information about a murder. She told them about Fan Mengyi. She told them about the flat in Chimshatsu. And she told them about the doll. The investigation that followed moved quickly once the police had a location. Officers went to the flat. What they found there, the doll, the bones, the physical evidence of sustained violence, confirmed the worst of what the girl had told them. The forensic examination of the site was extensive. The skull inside the doll was identified through dental records. Fan Mengyi, who had been missing since late 1998, was officially confirmed deceased in the spring of 1999. Chan Man-lak, Liang Xingqi, and Liang Weilun were arrested. The trial that followed was not simple. Criminal proceedings in Hong Kong in 1999 were conducted under a legal system that retained much of its British structure while beginning to absorb new influences. The case drew immediate public attention, not just because of its brutality, but because of its symbolism. The Hello Kitty doll, the teenage girl's nightmares, the hidden skull. These elements combined into something that felt almost cinematic in its darkness, and the Hong Kong press covered the trial extensively. But the law, in the end, operated on evidence, and evidence, in this case, carried its own complications. The charge of murder requires, in Hong Kong as elsewhere, proof of intent and causation. The prosecution had to establish precisely what each defendant had done, and in what sequence, and with what state of mind. The physical evidence established that Fan Mengyi had died as a result of sustained violence. The question of who did what, and who acted as principal and who as accomplice, was harder to answer with certainty. Chan Man-lak ultimately was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter. He was sentenced to several years in prison. The two women, Liang Xingqi and Liang Weilun, received lesser sentences. They were convicted of manslaughter as well. The public reaction to these sentences was of profound disquiet. People felt, with justification, that the charges did not match the crime, that Fan Mengyi had been subjected to something for which manslaughter was a structurally inadequate word, that the gap between what had been done and what the law was able to capture in this case was a canyon. There were protests, there were editorials, there were members of the legal community who argued carefully and on the record that the outcome had been shaped by the limits of available evidence as much as by the facts of the case. And there were people, many people, who felt that Fan Mengyi had been failed twice. Once by the world that put her in that flat, and once by the system that was supposed to speak for her after the fact. Chan Man-lak served his sentence and was released. He subsequently left Hong Kong. His current whereabouts are not publicly known. Fan Mengyi has no grave that the public knows of. Her remains, once identified, were returned to whatever family she had left behind. What happened to them after that, whether there was a burial, whether there are people who remember her privately, is not part of the public record. What is part of the public record is the case itself, and the case has endured. There is a particular phenomenon that true crime documentation tends to produce, a kind of secondary mythology that accretes around the original facts. Names become shorthand, objects become symbols, and in the process of becoming symbolic, the actual human beings involved can get lost, reduced to their role in the story rather than preserved as the people they were. Fan Mengyi was a woman who stole money, who worked in bars, who made decisions, some of them probably bad ones, in a life that hadn't given her much margin for error. She was 31 when she died. She had a name before the case gave her a new one. She had a history that belongs to her, not to the mythology. The Hello Kitty doll has become the image that defines the case in collective memory. It appears on true crime lists, in Wikipedia articles, in the kind of content that treats horror as a genre rather than a reality. The doll is unsettling precisely because of what it represents, the weaponization of innocence, the hiding of the unbearable inside the familiar. But Fan Mengyi is not the doll. She was a person, and that distinction matters more than the mythology does. The teenage girl who came forward, whose nightmares broke the case open, gave a testimony that required a degree of courage that is difficult to fully comprehend. She was 14 years old. She had seen things no person should witness. She had been in proximity to violence and complicity for months. And then she walked into a police station and told the truth, knowing what that truth would cost her, knowing that the people she was testifying against were people she had lived alongside. She has never been publicly identified. She received counseling, according to court records. What her life looked like after the trial, whether the nightmares stopped, whether she found a way to carry what she knew, is not something the public record can tell us. But we know she acted. We know that the case was solved because of her. And in a story that contains very little light, that is the closest thing to light that exists. There are questions that the case raises that have no clean answers. Questions about how a person like Chon Man-lok operates, how he recruits people into his orbit, how he maintains control, what the conditions are that allow someone to exercise that kind of power over others. Questions about what Fan Man-yi's life would have looked like if the first door had opened differently, if the theft was handled differently, if someone had intervened at any of a dozen earlier moments. There are also questions about the law, about the gap between what a jury can prove and what actually happened, about whether the sentences delivered in this case reflected the severity of what Fan Man-yi endured.
Many legal scholars who have studied the case believe they did not. The debate is not academic. It concerns the question of whether the legal system, even when it functions as designed, is capable of delivering justice for the most extreme violations of human dignity. In the years since 1999, Hong Kong's legal system has evolved. Protocols for handling evidence in cases involving sustained violence have been updated. The treatment of witnesses, particularly young witnesses, has been refined. None of these changes exist because of this case alone, but this case is part of the body of experience that shaped them. The flat in Tsim Sha Tsui no longer looks the same. The building exists, the street exists, the neighborhood exists. But the particular configuration of that space, the apartment where Fan Man-yi spent her final weeks, has been physically altered, if not demolished. Buildings in Hong Kong change faster than memory does. Memory, in this case, persists in several forms. The case appears in Hong Kong criminal justice textbooks. It appears in international true crime archives. It has been dramatized. In 1999, a Hong Kong film called Diary of a Serial Killer drew loosely from the case, though the production was controversial and the treatment was widely criticized as exploitative. It appears, periodically, in conversations about criminal justice reform. And it appears, year after year, in the quiet language of the internet, in the search results of people who have heard the name and want to understand what it means. What it means, stripped of mythology and shock value, is this. A woman died because she stole money from someone who believed he had the right to take her life in return. 3 people participated in her death and in the concealment of her remains. A 14-year-old girl found the courage to tell the truth about it, and the legal system, doing the best it could with the evidence available, arrived at an outcome that satisfied almost no one. That is the story. It is not a story about a doll. It is not a story about nightmares, though the nightmares are real. It is not even primarily a story about horror. It is a story about power, about who has it and who doesn't, about what happens when someone falls into the orbit of a person who believes their debts can be paid in suffering, about the particular vulnerability of people who exist at the margins of the economy, of the law, of the social structures that are supposed to protect everyone equally. Fan Man-yi existed at those margins, and those margins failed her. The girl who walked into the police station was also at those margins. She could have stayed silent. She could have convinced herself that silence was survival. Instead, she spoke. And because she spoke, the truth came out, imperfectly, incompletely, with all the limitations that truth always carries when it meets the formal machinery of justice. But it came out. Hong Kong has a word, gong, that refers to a kind of collective experience, a shared understanding that exists between people who have lived through the same thing. The city itself has that quality. It has been shaped by displacement, by transition, by the constant negotiation between what is remembered and what is allowed to be forgotten. The case of Fan Ma Ni is part of that negotiation. It sits in the archive. It surfaces periodically when someone decides it deserves to be told again. And every time it is told, the challenge is the same: to tell it in a way that preserves her humanity rather than consuming it. She was a Fang. She was 31 years old, she worked in bars and she made mistakes, and she ended up in a flat in Tsim Sha Tsui in the final weeks of 1998. And she did not deserve what happened to her. That is the truth that the girl carried out of that flat and into the police station. That is the truth that the nightmares were trying to say. It doesn't resolve neatly. It doesn't arrive at a place of closure, because closure is a concept that belongs to the living, and the dead cannot confirm it. What it arrives at is simply this: we know what happened, because one person refused to let it stay hidden. And in the long silence that follows, that is the thing worth holding on to.